Good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the SECAS Third Thursday Web Forum. I'm Hillary Morris. I work on user support and communications for the Southeast Conservation Blueprint on behalf of the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SECAS partnership. We've been hosting this webinar every third Thursday of the month for about 10 years now, and it's intended to provide an opportunity to share the latest updates about the blueprint, to get involvement and input from folks like you, and to highlight exciting science and tools in the world of landscape conservation in the Southeast region. So, here is our agenda for today. I'll start out by introducing our speaker, who will present for 30 to 40 minutes or so on our monthly topic. We'll have time for Q&A and discussion at the end, and then I will wrap up by previewing next month's webinar and sharing some updates from SECAS staff. As a heads up, we are recording this web forum just as an option for the one or two people who inevitably wanted to attend but had a conflict. So I'll post the slides and a link to the recording from the calendar event on the SECAS website within a couple of days. So any questions or comments before I introduce Amy and get us started? All right, so today's presenter is Amy Gutierrez, who is the Climate and Lands Coordinator with the Nature Conservancy in Georgia. And she is going to be talking about the Georgia Low Impact Solar Siting Tool, which is intended to help reduce spatial conflict between large-scale solar development and sensitive natural habitats. So TNC has developed this tool in combination with a whole bunch of other partners, and they did incorporate the blueprint along with a bunch of other great data. So with that, Amy, take it away.
All right, that sounds wonderful. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I don't need to introduce myself since Hillary gotta love technology. So sorry about that. Best laid plans. So hello, everybody. Since I came back again, I guess I just wanted to do, another entrance. Good morning. My name's Amy Gutierrez, and I am going to be talking about the Georgia Low Impact Solar Siting Tool. And here we hopefully go this time. Let me got a few screens not cooperating with me over here, so I'm gonna get it. All right, there we go. So low impact solar siting in Georgia, or solar siting in general. Why are we talking about this? Large scale solar, so utility scale solar, these solar farms, you might also hear them called. This is an important solution for us to be able to decarbonize at an impactful scale, but this type of technology requires significant land input. So we're dealing with this when we're dealing with a combined threat of both like a conservation crisis and a climate crisis. This is a really interesting challenge of both of these pieces kind of butting heads together. The Nature Conservancy across the board supports smart solar development and renewable development in areas that have a proactive focus on minimizing these environmental impacts. We want to find and incentivize the win-win scenarios where we can get both cleaner electricity and we can get habitat protection. We want to proactively minimize impact to our important natural resources here in Georgia. It would be gopher tortoise and longleaf pine ecosystems. Will probably come first to mind. So to this end, we have been focused on providing tools and data to decision makers to help advance what we call low impact siting of solar facilities. So this is solar facilities at a scale that are sited in areas with low environmental sensitivity to solar development. Based on TNC research about this global build out of renewable energy, developing in these low impact areas can benefit the local economy. It can reduce conflict and cost for the developers themselves, as well as the more obvious benefits of mitigating climate change and minimizing impacts to wildlife and habitat. And since I get the impression that we're not all necessarily here from Georgia, since this is a Southeastern crowd, just wanted to give a little snapshot about the challenges here in Georgia. It's different in every state in the Southeast. All of us are dealing with some slightly different nuances. So here are a couple of examples in Georgia of the kinds of challenges we're facing. The first example here is an area that surrounds the Fall Line Sandhills WMA, which you can see the WMA is outlined in yellow, and the kind of orange stars are within a short period of time how the WMA was surrounded basically on all sides by solar development, which really cuts off opportunity for the animals that rely in this area to be able to use the surrounding resources to be able to migrate, to be able to forage, things like that. This example here on the right is probably a more straightforward example. This one is near Fort Gordon in Augusta, where there was just complete land conversion and deforestation for the sake of this solar facility. Land conversion is happening the fastest in Georgia's southern coastal plain. This is the places where land is cheap and economic opportunities are limited, which is why this is a great place for this, economic driver. Unfortunately, this is also where our historic longleaf pine ecosystems once stood. There are no consistent environmental restrictions in Georgia when it comes to solar development. These are often on private lands, so there's no federal review requirements. We can't rely on state permitting for solar because there is none. Without federal species or wetland impacts, connecting and being able to utilize our federal agency partners is often just a courtesy in these private developments. So ultimately, any environmental requirements are beholden to individual cities and power purchasers like the utilities to determine what kind of restrictions there are, if any. So it's really a fascinating and challenging mosaic when you're dealing with all of these different pockets of what the rules and the guidelines are. So let's say, for argument's sake, that reliance on regulation is out. So how could the Nature Conservancy in Georgia influence these land decisions in perhaps a more voluntary way? Our state is politically conservative, and it is a very pro-business state. So we have been focused on the economic arguments that we can make through this low-impact solar siting principle. To that end, we're working to increase demand for low-impact renewable energy through corporate demand. So we've been in conversations with corporations about their procurement practices. So trying to drive up demand for not just renewable energy, but renewable energy that is also clean. And we are also trying to find the low-hanging fruit, or the win-win scenarios, which is trying to put solar on places that are already developed, or trying to promote solar in areas that we know to be low impact. The data analysis and tools that we've been doing here help find these preferred scenarios, and it also spreads the word that this is feasible, that low-impact solar can happen in Georgia at the scale we need it. These publicly available tools make it easier for folks to do the right thing. We are simplifying a significant amount of detailed, complex information into something that can be a little more actionable. So to guide these decision makers to better end decisions, this Georgia Low Impact Solar Siting tool was developed. This tool was born out of the conflict with gopher tortoises and solar. I had the pleasure of being in the field yesterday looking at some forest certification considerations, and I came across this handsome fella here on the left crossing the road, literally crossing the road. Good news is we were on TNC land, so he wasn't trying to get away from solar development, which is what I think the punchline of this joke should be. But for those of you who aren't familiar, or in a state that perhaps gopher tortoises are not, the gopher tortoise is our state reptile. It's considered a keystone species for our fire-dominated landscapes like the longleaf pine ecosystems that we aim to restore. This tortoise is also a state species of concern. It's a candidate for federal listing. It's also federally protected further west in its range, but it is not currently protected in the state. So it is a challenging situation where we're seeing significant impact to these gopher tortoises without necessarily having a way to prevent it. As solar development started exploding in rural Georgia, south of the Fall Line in our southeastern coastal plain, these gopher tortoises started to see immediate and lasting impacts that are continuing to this day, as I know my fish and wildlife friends and DNR friends can attest to with every single phone call. Solar developers are drawn to the same areas as these tortoises because they are flat, they are sandy, and there isn't a lot of vegetation. These kinds of lands also happen to be cheap. That's good for the solar developers. I have a feeling gopher tortoises probably don't care. So to try to address these circumstances, in 2017, the Nature Conservancy in Georgia partnered with Georgia DNR and Fish and Wildlife to sponsor a student project, what they call TERM, with the NASA developed program out of UGA. If you have not encountered this program, they connect with students and focus on utilizing NASA imagery and other high resolution imagery to solve real world problems. And this was a really interesting example of using these kinds of analysis, these kinds of imagery to do analysis to try to solve something that is, current and a really challenging active problem. There was so much student interest in this that we ended up being awarded 2 more terms to help us complete this work. I will admit I didn't join the Nature Conservancy until 2019, so some of this work does predate me, but it has been very rewarding to be able to bring this effort across the finish line. On the right here, this is the landing page, the introductory page to the Georgia Low Impact Solar Siting Tool, which was officially launched in March of 2021, which also felt like 4 lifetimes ago. And I should say, we're about to start getting into some of the data and some of the, more nuanced components of this. So if anybody has questions, feel free to just interrupt me, and it'll probably be easier to show with the visuals, but I know we've got some time at the end as well. So feel free to jump in here. But this is a good overview visualization of the kind of analysis that the students performed. So they did some modeling for what we identified as areas that would be suitable for solar. So this blue map on the left, the solar, what we call solar suitability model, was looking at the kind of land characteristics that solar developers and Georgia Power told us that they most look for, as well as relying on published literature and trade publications to make sure that we were being as precise as possible without, leveling the playing field or challenging some of these solar developers economically. The veins that you see in this blue map here on the left, which is the solar suitability map, are not the roads, which it might look like, but they're actually the higher voltage transmission lines across the state. This model considers solar intensity, considers land slope, the current land use, because again, they would prefer to not clear vegetation it's less costly if the land is already cleared, and proximity to transmission, which is probably what we heard to be the most important component of what they are looking for when they're looking for suitable sites. The second component of this analysis, which will be the focus of the rest of this presentation, is the red map in the middle. This is our environmental sensitivity map. And I will go into the specifics about how we did that and where that has gone. But we put these two together using a land use conflict identification strategy, LUCIS model, to create this map that sort of visualizes at the same time the level of solar suitability and the level of environmental sensitivity. We get these, these unique colors that help us identify the places where there might be most conflict, as well as the places that we might want to try to push for more solar. So this is not intended to try to, stop solar. We're just trying to get it, more solar, better solar in the right kinds of places. So that was the sort of the process that underpinned what we came up with in terms of the visual. The map here on the left is the overall preference map that was launched when this tool was launched in March of 2021. It's a publicly available web app that has not only this overall preference mapping scenario, but also provided some of the supporting data layers that folks were most interested in terms of the environmental sensitivities, floodplains. I can't remember exactly, conserved land, so land that's either federally or privately protected, things like that. After the launch, we began to notice that there were some locations that had pretty decent gopher tortoise habitat that were being flagged as suitable for low impact solar, which is not true and not what we were going for. So we needed to dig back into the data. Since the student terms were finished at this point, and I hadn't been with the project since the beginning, I was able to really take the reins and dig into the data and our methodology to see what might have happened and to see how we could improve upon what we had launched. We spent a lot of time troubleshooting these issues with our DNR and Fish and Wildlife partners. I proposed a few different options for revisions to our methodology and our data sets to try to increase the specificity of our data, which, spoiler alert, that's where the blueprint comes in. But this challenge actually gave me a chance to reconsider the process that the students used, which was a pretty manual and tedious process, knowing full well a tool is only worthwhile if it can stay current, and we want it to stay current. We want people to be able to rely on this tool. We landed on final methodology and rankings, and we completed the analysis and published in November of 2021. So we were able to do all of this data refinement between March and November of 2021, which when I say we, in terms of the analysis, it's a team of me. So that was very exciting to be able to accomplish. So what you see here is kind of the before. This is the analysis that the students did, and I just wanted to show it as we talk about sort of the data process and where the blueprint really fit into our solution to the challenges. The students utilized a weighted analysis where we identified data layers that seemed most relevant to this situation, most relevant to places that would be sensitive to solar suitability, to solar development, things like conserved lands, landscape connectivity, land use lane classifications, gopher tortoise habitat, things like that. Also, interestingly, and this is an aside that we could probably talk about for a day, but our initial analysis also included recognition of prime farmland because there is concern about conversion of farmland, productive farmland, to solar and what that might do to the food supply chain. So that was something that we considered during the first analysis. In terms of weighting, we ultimately decided, well, the students ultimately decided to weigh each layer the same. It ended up not having much of an impact on the results when they did the potential analysis. And the map here on the right was the original version of the environmental sensitivity map. The red areas are the areas that were most sensitive. The lighter areas or the white areas are the areas that were ranked as least sensitive. But as I said, we ran into some issues. Something went wrong during the analysis, or there was, some kind of fatal flaw, if you will. That makes it sound dramatic, but there was something going on that we needed to address and we needed to refine. And this is the process that we went through. Ultimately, the kinds of questions we asked ourselves as we were going through this process. So I think the first big question was, do we want to keep the same kind of analysis and just maybe tweak the weightings or, add an additional data layer or something like that? Ultimately, as a collective, and again, you'll hear this over and over again, but the importance of partnership on this project could not be understated. It would not be where it is without Fish and Wildlife, without DNR, without the Orion Society, without Georgia Power, and the solar developers providing us input along the way. So I will just continue to give shout outs there where I can. But ultimately, we decided that this weighted analysis seemed to dilute some of our rankings in a given location because it was, averaging them, kind of putting them together. So what we decided to do was adjust our methodology, and it's hard for me to describe without just being able to show y'all the numbers and, get into raster calculations, which nobody wants to do on a presentation like this. But what we tried to do was retain the highest ranking at each location and really then combine these data sets. It was more of an additive process than a weighted process. So the next question, and one that I mentioned, was, is there a way to simplify this this process? If we're going to have to redo all of our data analysis again anyway, let's see where we can streamline it. Let's see where we can make it more feasible to update in the future. And this is really where the blueprint became essential to what I think is a really strong outcome for this data set. We are using it as our base data layer. So being able to refer to something that is comprehensive and, partner supported and data that comes from so many varying sources and use that as our base data set really took a lot of the analysis and the concern about weightings and things like that out of our analysis. We were able to rely on the great work that's already happened here. We used the South Atlantic blueprint data set from 2021, given the level of specificity it had. At the time, there was a corner of Georgia that wasn't covered by the South Atlantic blueprint. So to overcome that, we also used the Nature Conservancy's Resilient and Connected Landscapes data. This is the national data set that looks at the lands that would be most resilient to climate change, most resilient to these connected landscapes that we will need as species need to adapt and evolve through a changing climate. We also used this data set in the original analysis, so this wasn't a new add. We just kind of calculated it differently this time. So we used that to kind of cover the northwestern portion of the state, but we used it across the state as well, just in case there were areas perhaps in that resilient and connected landscape that wasn't popping as much in the conservation blueprint data. So I do know that the resilient and connected lands are part of the blueprint. So, kind of amplification of the areas of highest concern, I think you could say there. So given our first experience, we wanted to take these base comprehensive data sets and really look at our state's particular issue we're having with solar, like the gopher tortoise, to make sure that it is being appropriately captured. Doing the analysis, we did find that we needed to add some additional data layers to really capture the gopher tortoise concerns. We also added layers for the eastern indigo snake, and we addressed some river buffers and river characteristics that we felt like weren't being identified in the existing data sets quite as much due to Georgia's history of river development and things. So the final piece of this analysis was, okay, we've decided on a methodology. We feel confident in the data that we're putting into this methodology. We'll do all of our lovely raster calculations and whatnot, and we get the same bivariate matrix. Okay, what do we do with that? How do we interpret this 12 square kind of complicated map into something that the public can interpret, that they can use, that they can really run with? We added a new preference category this time around of avoidance recommended to be able to, again, highlight and amplify our areas of highest concern. This is a benefit not only to the environment, but this is also a benefit to the solar developers, because these areas of highest concern are areas where they're likely going to have to relocate gopher tortoise populations, or they will run into additional time increases because of either public opposition or because of local permitting. So there's an economic benefit to the solar developers to avoid these areas that are going to have the greatest potential for these challenges that they will face. And there's a consideration of reputational risk. So many of the solar developers that I talk to, they are here doing solar development because they want to do the right thing, because they are interested in renewable energy and think it's the direction we need to go. So they don't want to have a reputation of perhaps, being developing in areas that become challenging, or that the public opposes, or that there's a significant impact there. So I know that this slide is maybe a lot, but folks always are interested in the data. So here's what we dealt with at the end. The data across the top is the data inputs that I was just mentioning that we determined to put into this model, with the blueprint being the first category that we used. The data across the side identifies how we ranked those data sets, because that was a manual process. Thankfully for the blueprint, they aligned so well with our ranking system that one was a no-brainer, but we did have to decide how to rank some of the rest of these. The resilient and connected lands data looks a little convoluted, but basically everything that was identified as confirmed diversity went into the highest category for sensitivity. The areas that didn't have confirmed diversity but were secured, either climate corridors or resilient areas, that was sort of the next level. And then the last level were vulnerable corridors or resilient areas that didn't have confirmed diversity. And then they're kind of the default data layer for basically everything else is vulnerable. So that's why vulnerable was our lowest rank there. And I could talk for hours about what we ended up doing with the gopher tortoise, because that was complex, and I'm really grateful to Georgia DNR colleagues Matt Elliott and Mary Lou Horan to really dig in a very detailed way to our gopher tortoise data to try to figure out what we were missing and what we needed to represent. Ultimately, the thing that we felt like we were missing was actually some of the sandhills data. So from how Mary Lou described it to me, that analysis doesn't always capture suitable habitat in sandhills because it shows up differently on some aerial imagery and things like that when you're having these habitat models. So that was kind of the key thing that we ultimately added into our ranking system. The Eastern indigo snake was a really interesting and fun partnership. We connected with the Oriane Society, who was doing some really exciting modeling for for indigo snake populations and habitat and things like that, as they were working with Fish and Wildlife at the time to maybe revise the Fish and Wildlife range boundaries for the Eastern indigo snake, which I should mention for those of you who are, again, not in Georgia, Eastern indigo snake is a federally protected species. So the model classifications and categories here are all thanks to the Oriane Society being willing to share their modeling data with me. And then the river data is thanks to my TNC colleague, Sarah Gottlieb, who does our freshwater resilience work here in Georgia. So worked with her to figure out which components of riverine systems maybe could be further amplified in our considerations for sensitivity. Whew, I know, that's a lot. I'm going to pause for a second because I feel like this is the place that maybe folks would be most interested in. Are there any questions while I've got this part up?
We do have one question from Jill in the chat. For those of us unfamiliar with this ecosystem and area, can you define what is meant by resilient with confirmed diversity, climate flow zone, and a climate corridor? I did dig up some definitions from TNC's website that I'll drop in the chat in case that's helpful to refer to, but if you wanted to answer that verbally as well.
Yes, that would be fantastic. And this data set is a national data set. And to be honest with you, I would have to go back into the definitions as well. And I would be happy to share the landing page for that data that does provide more of the context of what they mean by these different classifications. And it was challenging when we were trying to interpret this data into this ranking system to figure out exactly how to do it. But the Nature Conservancy's data set has done a really good job of kind of drilling down into levels of specificity. So there is a data set that's like just resilient, most resilient and connected lands. And then if you kind of dig down further, they are doing the interpretation based on areas that are identified as climate corridors, climate flow zones, and resilient areas. I cannot remember the specifications between the different ones, but what I know that they're looking at in this kind of analysis for, I believe it's flow zones and perhaps climate corridors as well, they are looking at areas that within a small geography have a variety of characteristics. So maybe that is an elevation change that could allow species to move to higher elevation or lower elevation as they need for a changing climate. There's the corridors are perhaps maybe a little more straightforward in terms of given the modeling for the way that the climate's likely going to change, where do we predict that these species are going to move and how do we protect those corridors, those movement corridors? And I can't remember, I'd have to look again for the resiliency considerations, but it is a really involved and robust data set that they're also updating all the time. So I love being able to pull this resilient and connected lands data, pull the blueprint data, and allow people that are smarter than me to do the really, really detailed analysis there. Does that help? Do you have any follow-up questions from that?
None in the chat so far, okay. But feel free to pop yourself on mute and respond if you want, Jill.
But no pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. Does anybody else have a question for Amy while we're paused kind of on this? Yeah, Ron Myers, I see that you have one. Feel free to unmute. There's a lot of background noise wherever you are. I think I can sort of hear that you're speaking, but I can't understand what you're saying, unfortunately. It almost sounds like there's a rushing wind behind you.
Can you put it in the chat?
Yeah, I'm gonna pop you back on mute, Ron, because all we hear is a ton of static. Sorry about that. If you want to type your question into the chat, I'd be happy to read it. I would like to imagine you're on like a cool boat trip right now or something really interesting. In the meantime, Ron, while you type that in, I'll go to a question from Neil. Can you tell me if your data includes the location of existing utility scale solar facilities?
Yes, good question, Neil, and apologies. I know that you were waiting on an email for me about that context. I'm glad we can just talk about it here. So the existing utility scale solar facilities are not included in the solar suitability model, as I recall, though there are components when the students were looking at the land classifications and what would make a site suitable in terms of parcel size and existing development and things like that. So it's sort of indirectly captured, but there isn't specific data in there for existing utility scale solar facilities. When the students were doing that analysis, the solar suitability analysis, which I think completed in their second term, so that was completed in 2017, 2018. There's just been so much more, there's so much more data available in terms of existing utility scale solar facilities, but also there's been such a significant increase in the solar facility since 2017. So even if we had included it, it wouldn't necessarily be current. And I'll talk about this with next steps, but refining and updating the solar suitability is actually one of the things that I would love to target going forward. So I do think it's something that would be beneficial moving on. And I see Ron was able to put his comment in. How much of this is automated now? None yet. Maybe not the answer we want to hear. What is exciting is that we do have, so utilizing, the way that technology evolves, I have a web services link to the blueprint data. I believe I have a web services link to the Resilient and Connected Lands data set as well. And so while the calculations and the raster calculation is still a manual process, it is much easier to get the data, and it's much more simplified, and it's only putting together a couple pieces as opposed to this more convoluted weighted analysis. I would love to set up some models and let it do it on its own, but this is sadly not my full-time job. So slowly but surely we are getting there. And Christine, thank you for putting the existing facilities up. That is, that's a great resource. And I see another question in the chat while I'm paused here. Yes, so the question of prime farmland is again, another fascinating challenge that this world of low impact solar has to consider and has to address. The first version we did, the initial modeling, did include prime farmland as one of the indicators of something that would be environmentally sensitive because it didn't quite fit into the solar suitability. It fit better into the environmental sensitivity, since that is something we need to avoid converting. It was the designation of what was identified as prime farmland. I believe that's an NRCS designation, but I would have to double check the data sets and the technical details, and I would be happy to do that. The prime farmland data set, data layer that we were able to acquire, if you look at it for Georgia, and I believe this is the case for, I think I've talked with colleagues in North Carolina at the very least, it's like the majority of the state, which we think is partly one of the challenges that, one of the causes, I should say, of sort of where our initial data analysis maybe went a little astray, is because of this really comprehensive prime farmland data set. If we could find something that was really more tuned in and more specific, I think that could still be something that we could include in the environmental sensitivity. And I don't know, but perhaps that's also built into some of the indicators in the blueprint. I would have to dig into the data sets there as well. But, it's something to be aware of. The other thing I would note from the evolution of solar development in Georgia specifically, but I know it's happening in other states as well, from when this was originally launched, is there's more, I think I'm seeing on the horizon more opportunity for agrovoltaics. So co-location of agriculture in conjunction with solar facilities. It is more expensive for the developers. It takes, slightly different layouts of solar panels and things like that, but there is an added benefit. There would be an opportunity for farmers that need more income, more steady stream of income, but still really want to be connected to the food supply, to perhaps have a win-win there. So I personally, and this is, not confirmed by anyone else other than me, but I see more opportunity for that sort of approach, more of the design consideration approach to address that question of farmland conversion than where the data sets are currently, to be able to do it on the data side, on the siting side. But it is something we need to be watching out for.
Well, thanks for these great questions, y'all, while we're paused. I'm not seeing anything else coming in, so maybe if you want to go on to your next steps, and then we can pause again.
Perfect. Sounds good. Let's get the slideshow moving again. There we go. Because everyone likes a map. I wanted to put up the pretty maps, the final maps. So this is where the tool stands currently. So if you go into the tool right now, this is what you will see, this map on the right. This is our overall preference map. This is also the solar suitability, that's the same map you saw at the beginning. So that's the same analysis that the students did, the blue one. The environmental sensitivity is our updated environmental sensitivity. And I think it really highlights these unique sensitive ecosystems around these riverine systems, around gopher tortoise habitat. You know, it's a little more red in the coastal plain than perhaps further up north where there's more development and more tree cover as well. One thing I will note again, this is not a comprehensive Georgia environmental sensitivity. We are looking at the characteristics that would be most sensitive to the kind of solar development you see. So the kind of development you see with these solar facilities, which is why there was such a focus on gopher tortoises, on longleaf pine, on eastern indigo snake, these things that were seeing the highest degree of conflict. The purplish reddish map kind of in the middle here, this is our updated conflict map. So the same concept of putting these together in a bivariate analysis. And then the final map, the map on the right, is our overall ranking system. And what we call this is our siting preference for low impact solar. This tool is not designed to be a go, no-go tool. It's not designed to tell solar developers where they can and can't develop. That's not our role. What our role is trying to identify the areas that are at highest conflict and the areas at lowest conflict, and trying to move the needle, trying to push it toward, you know, more blue if it was yellow, more green if it was blue, seeing if we can move things that might have been cited in the red, this avoidance recommended category. But this is, you know, this is not if you cite in the red, you're going to have to, you know, the federal government's going to get involved and you're going to have to do a permit. It's not necessarily that level, but it's trying to be a proxy for these places that you're most likely to run into these higher degrees of conflict. This is the busy slide, and I'll just talk through it briefly, but I did want to put some examples up here. You know, we are tracking the impact of this tool, seeing kind of how it evolves. The fact that so many of y'all were able to join us today and were interested in joining us today, I'd say is a good sign. So we're getting some traction here. Partners are aligned around this idea. Fish and Wildlife and DNR have been really beneficial in amplifying this message, utilizing these data sets like we're doing here with the conservation blueprint, you know, provides us that avenue of being able to talk about the fact that the data is supported by our partners. Wanted to mention a little bit that, you know, representatives from Georgia Power were involved in the initial discussions with the solar suitability component of this, but they've also been involved in our discussions in our refinement process too. Their natural resource specialists have been involved in making sure that what we are capturing on this map aligns with what they are seeing in the field in terms of impact, and they have been really interested in referencing this tool potentially in an RFP type situation, request for proposal that they put out to purchase solar energy. And it's really exciting to see that evolution of that interest there. In terms, and I see, and this kind of gets into it, but in terms of industry response, I'm receiving more inquiries every day from solar developers that want the data sets, that want to learn about the tools. I'm connecting with a number of consultants that are, you know, pulled in when the solar developers are trying to make these decisions. So I think that's encouraging, and the feedback I have received from them is that it is really helpful, especially for them. That environmental sensitivity layer, that more detailed, more refined environmental sensitivity layer is really what they need to be able to help make these decisions. So I think that that is encouraging, and the fact that we were able to receive feedback from solar developers, from utilities early on about what this tool should be and perhaps what this tool shouldn't be, in terms of trying to tell people what to do and what not to do, you know, avoiding that, avoiding trade secrets, avoiding trying to level the playing field for solar development, because it is a really competitive field, these kinds of things, I think ultimately is what makes this tool and this approach and these siting decisions that are happening really across the country. TNC is doing this work across the country in various ways, depending on the area that's biggest concern. But I think that's what makes this successful, is bringing all of these partners together and saying, like, okay, what do you need? What do you need? How can we put this together? I've received inquiries from a number of state agencies and Fish and Wildlife offices, regional offices, as well as state-specific offices, wanting to also to utilize our methodology and do something like this for them based on their individual concerns with their region or with their state, or, you know, whatever their characteristics are, because it is something that, you know, goes one step beyond the existing data sets and really kind of goes into that interpretation. And it seems like the feedback from the field that I'm receiving thus far is encouraging. This tool has not yet been included as a requirement in the RFP process for either Georgia Power or another utility like an EMC or a MEAG, electric municipal co-op, or a municipal co-op. So I think in terms of it being mandated and the industry being forced to use it, we are not there. But I am pleased with the progress we're seeing in terms of interest and willingness to use the tool, because the way that we have tried to approach it. You know, we're also just trying to get the word out there more. So this tool, you know, this version of the tool just launched in November of 2021. So it hasn't been out there very long. The tool itself launched in March of 2021. You know, we're still working on putting together outreach materials. We're still working on, you know, putting trainings together, things like that. So it is early days in the tool, but I'm just really excited about the possibilities here. We were able to feature this project on the Yale Climate Connections podcast for any of y'all that are connected with that. That came out, I think, earlier this year. We've connected with our friends at SURPASS, the Southeast Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability. They referenced this tool as a resource in their energy siting group. We've been heavily connected with Drawdown Georgia, which is a Georgia-specific implementation group of researchers looking at project drawdown, so the drawdown solutions for the world, and trying to identify which of those solutions are feasible in Georgia. Large-scale solar really pops as one of their most impactful solutions for decarbonizing. So we have been connecting with them to make does not say solar at all costs, because ultimately I think that would not be the direction that we want to go. That's some things that we can't undo. We need to be a little more proactive. So we've been connecting with them. And there is also a spinoff from this work that they're doing that has put together a business compact of folks that are interested in trying to push the envelope on corporate engagement and corporate audiences to follow these principles and increase the decarbonization. And we've connected with the business compact. I'm a member of the electricity component of that business compact. So, you know, trying to push corporations to push the needle on this, trying to increase corporations to push demand for this, because again, in a state that has no permitting, like ultimately what we're going to need is a demand-driven response to really see impact, because ultimately, if this is more expensive, we're just not going to get there. So I'll put this up, go through this real quick, and then I can answer a couple of the questions that have come in since then, and we're almost out of time, so maybe I'll go through this quick. Anyway, next steps, there's a lot more to do here. I think I kind of just covered that. Continuing more outreach to developers, to utilities, to local planners, corporate engagement, as I was just mentioning, and data and modeling refinement. I'm looking forward to playing with the next Blueprint data set when it launches. So Hillary, I know we are at time. Do you want me to answer a question, or do you want me to let you take it away?
Why don't you go ahead and answer Mona's question that's in the chat?
Okay.
And then Mona's asking, have you totaled the area of land that is preferred for low impact development?
Yes, I have. I've done some interesting calculations there in terms of trying to put it in something that makes it relative to the kinds of speed we need to see here in solar, like to meet some of these benchmarks. Like the solar energy industry is trying to hit 30% solar electricity by 2030. So they want, of the US electricity grid, they want 30% of that to be coming from solar. And if we look at that in Georgia, because Georgia's a great place for solar, you know, there is significant impact there. If we were able to do the siting that's needed to hit that threshold by 2030, that would all in low impact. We would be protecting, depending on the math, 12 to 15% of the most sensitive areas in Georgia, which I think is just really, really impactful. And I don't remember the total acreage. I'd have to go back to my Excel spreadsheet, but I did look at that because I was very curious about it.
Well, thank you so much for this great talk, Amy. And yeah, it's clear from how many people came that this is a topic of huge interest, and it's really exciting and innovative work. And we're so happy that the blueprint was able to be helpful to you in this way. And we're also very, like you, excited to see what you think of the new version and whether that's an improvement will at least fill in that gap in the northern part of Georgia that you mentioned. So just for time, I'm going to take back presenter power and just wrap up with a preview of next month's web forum. And then seems like good timing to talk about this new blueprint update that has been mentioned a couple times. So next month, we're going to be hearing from Yvonne Allen with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who's also one of the amazing GIS analysts who works on the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. And she's going to be talking about her landscape scale assessment of floodplain inundation frequency using Landsat imagery project. So this will be the same time, same connection information as today on September 15th, the third Thursday of September. So this data set has been recently expanded nationally and is available in a new Google Earth Engine app. The idea behind this project was that in large river ecosystems, the timing, the extent, the duration, and the frequency of inundation can really affect fish and wildlife habitat and the ecosystem services that river system provides. And a better understanding of the patterns of floodplain inundation could really help us conserve that landscape more effectively. But up until now, there hasn't really been a widely available spatial data set that gets at kind of the dynamic aspects of floodplain inundation. So this project was really looking to fill that gap, and it's using Landsat imagery to generate different observations of inundation extent under different hydrologic conditions, and then kind of mosaic or combine those together to estimate the relative inundation frequency on the landscape. So that's going to be a really interesting talk, especially if you are into rivers and floodplains and good aquatic stuff. And then an update from our SECAS staff. I wanted to let you know where we stand with progress on Southeast Conservation Blueprint 2022. I'm excited to say that we have finished the modeling for the base blueprint, as we're calling it, which is going to form the base of most of the Southeast Blueprint this year. So this is a consistent approach, methods, and indicators across 15 states of the Southeast, and it's going to form the basis of most of this year's Southeast Blueprint. So we're kind of transitioning from this quilt approach where we're stitching together lots of different sub-regional inputs, including the South Atlantic, which Amy talked about today in her talk, and really replacing that quilt approach with a more consistent methodology. And so we were able to incorporate a lot of amazing feedback from our workshop series back in May. So we have finished the modeling, the corridors, combined it all together. So now we are focused on finishing documentation, getting all of this data online and loaded and publicly available. We are on track to release by the end of October. So we're very excited to be on track to hit that. And at the same time, while we're finalizing the data and getting it online, we're also working on the viewers where you can access this data and trying to make that as functional and easy to use as possible. We've had for the last couple of years our Blueprint Explorer viewer, which has been in beta. And so this year, coinciding with this big Blueprint update, we are making that viewer fully functional so that you're able to not only see the types of summaries of the blueprint and indicators that you've been able to do up until now, but drill into individual pixels and look at how the blueprint and indicators are scoring. We're also adding some filtering based on the indicators so that you can look at the part of the blueprint that scores a particular way on the indicators or that is impacted to a certain degree by a threat. We're updating the sea level rise and the urbanization data that's going into the viewer. And of course, your custom reporting will still be functional and available for you. It's just that you'll be able to look at the underlying indicators across a much larger area with this new base blueprint approach. So we are very excited about the updates to the viewer, and we're also working on an ArcGIS Hub data portal where all of these data and map services will be available to explore. And then, as always, you'll be able to download the data directly into your desktop GIS if that's how you prefer to work with it. So we're all just trying to get over the finish line with this blueprint, but the end is in sight, and we're very excited that it's nearly there. So I always like to end on this slide, how to get more involved in SECAS. I'd encourage you to sign up for the SECAS newsletter. If you haven't already, you can do that on the footer of any page of our website, secassoutheast.org. Please reach out to your SECAS staff, especially our user support staff. We're here to help you if you are interested in using the blueprint in your work to inform planning, to strengthen a grant proposal. That's why we're here. So please go to that staff page and reach out to us. And then, of course, we encourage you to explore the blueprint online. You can currently explore the 2021 version, the most recent, and then that version 2022 is coming soon. So that's really all I have. We do have 2 more minutes. If anybody has thought of a question they wanted to ask Amy in the meantime, or me, please feel free to jump in. All right, hearing none, thank you all again so much for tuning in. Thank you, Amy, for this great talk, and I hope to see you all in September. Have a great rest of your week.